Hello and warm welcome to the third edition and last edition of our online seminar around climate lies. And today we would like to talk precisely and concretely about certain measures and strategies against climate disinformation, want to exchange ideas and to learn more about best practices and, of course, open to you, to the audience. We have gathered quite some people today, and this is, of course, a pleasure. And our three speakers, Alexandra Gese, she's a member of the European Parliament and Vice President of the Greens EFA Group. There she is in our European Parliament. And for the first time with us is Felix Kröner, who is policy advisor at Reset Tech, which is an initiative that tries to foster democracy. And then third, Katja Jäger. Katja is head of digital democracy and managing director at Better Place Lab. This is a digital social think tank and do tank from Berlin. And I'm really happy to have you all here. My name is Veran Meyer, and I'm working here in the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, responsible for the digital policy, and will lead you through the day or the seminar. As I said, this is the third edition, and this seminar has been organized together with Katharina Klabrek and Sorina Sina-Siebert and Alexandra Gese. And well, the first two colleagues from the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, Alexandra Gese from the Parliament. I've talked about disinformation. Jenny King from Strategic Dialogue was with us. She explained a little bit better who are the actors, the main players of disinformation, what are the strategies, how are those contents disseminated, which was then the foundation for the second edition when we talked about conspiracy groups and right-wing populists. And we could welcome Claire Duvignon. She is a speaker of Fridays for Future in Germany and climate activist. Katharina Schulze, a Green politician from Bavaria, and Alexandra Gese, who have shared their experience and have shown what climate disinformation really means for activists and for policymaker, and how those conspiracy groups and right-wing populists use this disinformation in the German debate. Both seminars have been recorded, and you have the possibility to watch them whenever you want on our YouTube channel, and the link will be shared in the chat. And this is then the perfect transition to our housekeeping remarks. This is another seminar that will be recorded. You were asked to give your consent. It will be published on our YouTube channel, and there is an English simultaneous interpretation. So if you wish to change your channel, you simply have to click on the little globe icon, choose English, and follow the interpretation. And questions can be asked via the Q&A tool or FAQ tool. We will have an hour, a little bit more. And just briefly on the setting, our three panelists will start with a short statement. Alexandra will start and kick it off, followed by Katja Jäger, who will talk a bit more in detail about those concrete measures to combat climate lies, and Felix Kröner will give you a bit more context on the European elections and the role of the bigger platforms. And then we have 15 minutes time for a panel discussion and move on with our questions. And with that, I would like to hand over to Alexandra. Of course, you are a well-known face here among our panelists, but there might be a few who do not know you. Since 2019, you're a member of the European Parliament. Since 2022, you are the Vice President of the Greens EFA group, of the parliamentary group in the European Parliament, and within the Greens group, you are an expert on disinformation, platform regulation. This is surely what the majority know you. So you're one of the main negotiators for the DSA, the Digital Services Act. And with that, over to you. Thank you so much, Veran, for this introduction, and a warm welcome to all our participants here to the seminar from the European Parliament in Brussels. And this is a very topical event, and report has just been issued saying that disinformation, misinformation are the biggest short-term risk, and climate change is the biggest long-term risk. And this is not a report of an institute that's close to the Green Party. This is the report of the World Economic Forum. Climate disinformation is the third pillar of the hate speech that right-wing populists use. Migration is the first pillar, then the homosexual and queer communities, the second pillar, and then the third one is the third. The third pillar is disinformation that is used as agitation or screenmongering by the right-wing populists. So the policymakers as a whole are to be attacked by those groups. So the question is what we can do in the first two editions we have entered into analysis, and now the question is risen what we can do against it. People are making their voices heard saying that we should simply prohibit it, but then of course we're living in a democracy and we have the liberty of speech, so it is very difficult to use those instruments, and everything that has to do with climate protection and climate change is based upon evidence, on science. Science and evidence is changing, and therefore it's very difficult to distinguish between right and wrong information. And then we have those people that simply deny that the climate change really exists. They want to raise resistance against those measures and are saying that the measures are right, but not only we here in Germany and Europe have to be the ones who have to react. So we have three different thematic areas to combat disinformation. First of all, climate protection should not be regarded isolated as an environmental protection measure, but as to embed it into a social and economic environment. We want to establish measures that are socially acceptable and to look at the impact on our economy and our industry, because of course we would like to achieve an industry that is more sustainable than it is right now. But then of course we need political majorities, and those majorities for a socially acceptable climate change are put at risk by disinformation. Second, how do we communicate those messages? It's not only about reasonable arguments. What kind of tone do we use? How do we make sure that social cohesion is guaranteed, and make climate change not only a task for a small portion of our population, but of all of us, that it is part of them, that they have a positive link, nexus to it, and find themselves identified with it. And then last but not least, digital regulation. How can we avoid that disinformation is put up on the priorities list, and how can we try to avoid that groups are combating one another and that those messages go viral? Those are the three main tasks that we face, and I'm really looking forward to this great panel with our three speakers, Katja Jäger from The Better Place and Felix Rönner from Reset Tech, and I'm looking forward to questions as well. Thank you so much, Alexandra, for your introductory words. And I would say Katja could be the next one to intervene. I would like to briefly introduce you. For a few years, you are working at the Better Place Lab and are working at the interface of digitalization and democracy. And finally, you are bringing together many actors of the civil society in order to find the right way to systematically deal with this information. And this is something that is really of paramount importance for this seminar. You have been a guest lecturer at the Federal School for Economic Law, and we're really looking forward to your input. Thank you so much for the introduction. I would like to add on what's been said by Alexandra. What we work on in the Better Place Lab is to have less isolation, to have a better collaboration with our civil society on the side of the good ones, so to say, those who are in favor of a social and ecological transformation. questions like how do we create those digital spaces to do that? And in that sense, we have issued a study with other actors on disinformation. We have worked with perspectives from media regulation, from fact checking. We have asked the big question of how this phenomenon of disinformation, how consciousness can be raised and to be make people more aware. So disinformation is like an added value chain. Disinformation is created, disseminated, and try to find a big target group, which unfortunately does work quite well. So in the study, you can look into who are those big players who is involved, who are the most known actors of this disinformation campaign. And what we do as the next step, and what I would like to put in the focus of our attention, that we take a systemic approach. When we look at the added value chain of disinformation, then we are always we're already in the logic of reaction. But I would like to ask myself, how does an information chain look like? How can I act and inform and not only react in order to have this counter argument heard? And what we say once and again, that disinformation is a phenomenon that we have to look at as a whole. What does it tell us about the state of affairs in our civil society if it's so successful? And then I have to scale it up. Why do I have to deal with the trust crisis of our institutions? Why does this trust, this confidence that people have in our institutions is reducing year after year? As Massad has written a book on the big gap on information. We have the political and open sector lags behind the different platforms. And once again, we are in a position to react. And this is something we want to get out of. If I want to look at how we deal with disinformation in climate protection, we've said so already. This is a social issue that has been to be embedded in the social environment. Chico Mendes said ecology without the class fight is only taking care of your garden. So we have to look at how we socially embed the whole issue of climate change. This is a huge paradigm shift that's behind it. So how did we establish the relationship between the human being and the nature? Maybe the era of the Anthropocene has passed. And if we look at systemic solutions, I think for example, that the minimum salary is a good idea, which allows people to have money, sufficient money with a basic income in order to take care of their lives. They can move differently across the city, then can take care of themselves better and act better. And then another anecdote from our workshop, the workshop program. We call it systemic approach to disinformation. In the end, we have reflected what we see in the outside. One participant, one person said, well, the diesel motors, combustion motors are really not that bad. And it's not a human-made climate change. And we said, wow, we have people in the room that try to depict it differently as to what we want to do. And he wrote a lot or sent a lot of articles in the chat why diesel motors are really not that bad. And then we've elevated in our space. What happens in this workshop room with 10 people? We have one skeptical people and 9 other people say that it's not good what you say. And we get up right into the confrontation. Of course, we did not change his mind. So we looked into his fears, the worries and sorrows he might have, and then tried to observe or regard this climate issue like a personal issue. And we created a trustworthy space where this person got the space to express himself. And of course, it is more difficult when we want to scale it up and level it up. then we've seen that climate change or the climate debate is separating people. And we as actors have a responsibility. We have to see how we might have contributed to this gap, to the separation of our society. And this would be something I wish for, of how we can change our communication models. How can we achieve to not only work with pro and con, but to draw a bigger picture, to create a narrative that is future forward-looking and to open up a space that is not only based on facts and evidence. Studies show this and that because this is something we are all aware of, but why are they not more successful, those studies? And our activists, our civil actors have a responsibility. How do we present ourselves with our communication strategy to the outside, and how can we improve our relationship work? Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your experience. I think it's quite an interesting question. So let's take it on to the discussion later on. And now we are looking forward to the next short input. Felix Röhner, he's policy advisor at Reset Tech. Reset is in favor of digitized democracy, and you are a specialist for platform regulation and disinformation. And as I've read, you are also at D64 and working in the platform AG. Well, thank you very much. We at Reset over the past year have looked into different European settings, in particular Spain and Slovakia, and we've realized that hate speech and scaremongering was quite prominent. So on the one hand, we are looking with a little bit of fear towards the EU elections, but with the DSA, we have a good regulatory framework, which can be really helpful if it's implemented in the right way and can protect us. In the second part, I will go more into detail in terms of the DSA, the Digital Services Act. But first, I would like to say what organizations can do to counter climate disinformation, also with regard to the elections. So first of all, the monitoring, and secondly, an adaptation of the communication strategy based on the monitoring. So it's quite important that organizations do know what kind of actors spread which narrative and on which platforms are they busy, which channels do they use, and especially the multipliers are very important in this regard. What we've seen during the electoral campaigns in Spain and the Slovak Republic is that the usual consumer spread certain narratives or perceive certain narratives, but the biggest influence is emanating by or from influencers, so big accounts which spread disinformation narratives deliberately and which have a lot of followers. So in Germany, for example, it's Deutschland Kurier or different channels from Pegida founder Lutz Bachmann, for example, and you have to take a closer look at them. And the multipliers are so important because, as we could see in the so-called farmers' protests, is that climate disinformation is also a geopolitical weapon, which is used in a targeted way through large platforms like Telegram, but also others. The protests are connected to weapons deliveries to Ukraine, which is quite a common pattern, which we know also from the Kremlin, from other contexts. The energy crisis, or when the war in Ukraine started, it is connected to a lack of security within the EU, and it undermines the EU elections. So the relevant entities like BND and others also explicitly look into climate disinformation because there's this nexus. But with regard to what organizations themselves could do is do the monitoring and adapting their own communication strategy. So of course we have to ask ourselves what kind of narratives are the ones that I want to reply to, because it doesn't always make sense to enter into a discussion or to, debate certain narratives, actually. And of course, you also have to adapt it to the respective platform and target group. But it's also very important for organizations to create capacities for reporting and for damaging content. And you cannot rely on the proactive management of content of the platforms, and neither can you rely on the reactive management, because less than 15% of the content the one reported and the one that was not reported is being withdrawn. So no matter whether you report certain content or not, the reply that you get from the platform is usually non-existent. So usually they do not take away the content from the platform. So to come back to the regulatory level, so before the Digital Services Act, when I use a platform, for example, open an account with Facebook, then my content is being moderated or withdrawn based on the regulations set up by Facebook itself. With the Digital Services Act, for the first time, we have a framework for that. So it's a first approach. I mean, there are many provisions. I do not want to go into much detail, but there's also this evaluation. Of course, the Act does not say, okay, platform, you have to take away this content and this content can stay, but the platforms have to do their own risk assessment, and based on it, they have to take risk mitigating measures. So, for example, there has been a lawsuit now against X, the former Twitter, and also the Bundesnetzagentur is about to implement the DSA. But what we do see is that climate disinformation is not a systemic problem under Article 34. Under Article 34, there is a list on specific systemic risks, for example, public health, integrity of elections, etc., where the platforms have to conduct a risk assessment. But climate disinformation, unfortunately, is not being considered as a systemic risk under this article. But as we've already mentioned, it's relevant for the public safety, for the societal discourse. So we do see some possibilities to apply the DSA on climate disinformation as well. And it's very important to know that the DSA is, of course, also looking at algorithms. So it's not about only deleting content or the question of whether something is deleted or not, but the search for climate disinformation could be made more difficult, or content for example, we can see to it that content is no longer pushed or recommended. Of course, we are quite concerned regarding the elections and AI-generated content. For example, in the Slovak elections, we could see that fake videos were emanated, fake texts were broadcast. However, here the DSA could act. However, this is also the biggest threat that we see for elections. So this is content that is not being generated by AI. So it would be very important that the DSA is implemented in the right way. We would like to see a code of conduct, mandatory code of conduct in the course of the DSA. We see that voluntary self-commitments do not work in the pharmaceutical industry, the energy sector, etc. We've seen all this, so we cannot simply assume that the big platforms will regulate themselves. So we need a code of conduct which is mandatory. And the same holds true for political advertisement. There's been an agreement between the Parliament and the Council, so we consider it quite important, as we've seen as the Slovak Republic, where fake content has also been spread by parties themselves. So, for example, the right-wing party Republika, which spread fake content. And if I might utter a last wish from Reset, we would like to see an authority which is responsible for fake news, like in Sweden or other countries. Thank you very much, Felix. I would like to bring back Katja and Alexander onto the panel, so please switch on your camera again. Thank you very much. So now we have heard many different approaches. Felix, you've just talked about regulation, and maybe we can take a closer look at it in a moment. I mean, you also mentioned the elections and AI-generated content, and Alexandra, you were talking about the tasks. Maybe we should take one step back, because in the audience, I'm sure there are many people who would like to know in concrete terms what they can do, what they themselves as an individual can do. I mean, this is not undisputed, of course, and we will look into it in a moment. So this could be one question, and maybe the other question could be, what can associations and organizations do? So who would like to start? I can start, or Alexandra? No, okay, I'm going to start. Okay. In the introduction, I already touched upon that, and Felix picked it up. So it's a question of changing your communication strategy. I really do believe, as I said, we have to turn our reaction into action, and we have to look into it. We need a fruitful exchange, but we also need to shape a fruitful exchange. We should make an honest communication offer and not just put out information as a reaction to disinformation, just spread facts. So if we see that this is not really convincing people, I need a bigger strategy. So this means we really have to take the time. I mean, climate is also a huge topic. So to talk about a specific topic and to think about the role of the own organization and the communication strategy of the organization, and then we need to open up room for dialogue, honest room for dialogue, and think about what is happening with the people that I would like to reach. And maybe I can also offer small dialogues with people. So I think it's much more work than simply think about the next posting and how it might look like. Thank you very much, Alexandra. Would you like to add to that? Yes, I think in the communication we have to differentiate enormously, always dependent on the target group, in particular when it comes to the online communication and when it comes to individuals and not organizations, individuals who would like to discuss. So it's quite a wide known insight that some people who are really believing in certain things like a right-wing conspiracy theory. I mean, there's no use of discussing with them, not least online, and you should not spend too much time on that because these are actually also targeted attack strategies. I mean, there is this strategy that they attack specific people because they think themselves that these people want to change their lifestyle. And so we should rather focus on positive sides and have a positive discussion. But as Felix has already mentioned, and we've already seen in the previous events, it is a political and an economic strategy, this climate misinformation. And so it's of no use to make a huge effort as an individual. So you clearly have to distinguish with whom are you talking, and are you talking to an individual or an organization? But when it comes to the online realm, when people are being attacked, and this is happening time and again and more frequently, meteorologists, journalists, and everyone who's acting and standing up in favor of the climate protection are being attacked. And of course, you can add a comment like climate protection is important or something like that, so that the people who are in the first row are not only receiving hate speech comments and are withdrawn from the debate, which is actually why these comments are put there in the first place, but also see some positive reactions. And this is something that everyone can do. You do not have to quote certain sources to do that, why something is bad or good or whatever. You can just say, like climate protection is important, so just a positive comment. But you should neither forget that we also see structural problems which are rooted in the platforms themselves. And sometimes it's due to political interests of some countries or of some industries, like the fossil fuel industry, which are basically coming together in certain aspects. So this is why we really have to make good use of our resources. And as Katja said, to have an analog event and do not start a discussion with your neighbor because he's got an SUV, but for example, commend him because he's got solar panels now on the roof, or something like that.
Thank you so much for those very precise proposals. Felix, I would like to Well, first of all, I agree and compliment on that and underline how differently we should approach individual people and organizations. I think Alexandra depicted it quite well. Organizations, it is super relevant to see who do I approach, who do I talk to, what are the channels I use. On the other hand, I think usually we don't really have time enough, but for big organizations, it really makes sense to establish certain relationships to regulatory institutions like the Federal Network Agency. And once I do have those relations established, and then I have a list of evidence, you never know where to put it, and you send it to the wrong entities. And it's very good to have those established channels where we can send it over. First of all, for the organization itself, and then on the other hand, to have a certain evidence body. So a volume of evidence for regulatory institutions in order to be able to tackle the organizational risk. So it helps within the DSA to have a midterm and long-term strategy. Just one thing. Katja briefly mentioned it. I don't know if it was heard well. In organizations, it is super important that they understand what is behind it. So what we just explained. So there are very directed strategies. It's not people who are complaining on the new heating systems or who don't like our coalition. It is a very precisely worked on strategy, and so we can take it up and look it up later. It's very important that those organizations understand what this is all about, and then will tell their employees, their members. So there are expert panels who don't really know that this is a very precise strategy, and to be aware of it and to use it in our debates with multipliers, with our policymakers who might not know it, to repeat it once and again that those are very directed, concrete attacks. And this is might be the step that is lacking, that people understand the hate speech and all the way of spreading this disinformation. This is not something that goes without saying, but it is a strategy. Thank you, Katja. This is something that you do in your workshops. Do you want to briefly present what you offer from Better Place? Or you can put it in the chat. This might be interesting for our listeners. Many, many very interesting issues. We have mentioned several times that the European elections are not very far away. And Felix, you have touched upon the whole scope of the regulatory framework. We might break it down for our listeners. Targeting of political online advertising. This is not something that might have a lot of weight now, just with the elections coming up. What can we expect? So what will be the hate speech that one can expect against climate protection? How strong is our regulatory framework? How well can we combat it? And then I would like to take up one of our first questions from the audience. If you could briefly mention AI-generated disinformation and the impact it might have on our elections. Felix, looks like you would be interested. Yes, absolutely. Reset thinks that we have to expect a lot of disinformation, climate disinformation. And interestingly, when I heard about the report of the World Economic Forum, this reflects our experience from the Spanish and the Slovakian elections, so migration, climate change, and everything. This is are those issues that are dominating in the disinformatory field, and AI-generated content is another big risk that we perceive. Political opponents might be discredited, fake news are spread, people are attacked personally, and the whole political system maybe, or different party plans are try to be distorted, to misdisplayed and that the information is weaponized in order to pursue a certain political opinion. So this is a risk that we perceive. This is something that we have to expect for our European elections. How does the regulatory framework look like? In terms of the European election, it is indeed the first time that we have a use case for the DSA, so all the rules for the bigger platforms have just entered into force. So the European election might be one of the first use cases for the DSA, but of course, not all digital service coordinators are on board and operative. So it might not be full-fledged, 100% working. So it might not have used up all its potential until the elections take place. But on the other hand, in many European countries, we have a very active civil society to collect evidence, to build up capacities, to look into the systemic risk, and to push enforcement procedures against that specific platform. So it is not 100% up and running, but I'm quite positive that the DSA will make a difference when the European elections are up. And in terms of the code of conduct, we did have a previous code of conduct, and in summer 2022, a new code of conduct was issued. And between the summer of 22 and the spring of 23, this is a report of the European Commission, disinformation has been spread by the Kremlin, and it reached 156 million people, and 16 billion times is the clicks that those contents received. And all this happened during the operation of the code of practice, where it was already in force. So it's really important to mention once again that this code of practice or this code of conduct becomes mandatory. Alexandra, did you want to react on that? I think Felix covered quite a bit already. I might add just one fact. When we talk about the DSA, the Digital Services Act, for those who are not familiar with the acronym, I think there are two things that are important when we look at the Article 34 of risk assessment. The European Commission is working on the implementation of several articles, the AI-generated content. This is one of the focal points of their work, which is really good, but that's not all and not sufficient. The big problem are two mechanisms. First of all, interaction-based ranking, or engagement-based ranking. So the more interaction we have, people or participants react on in content, it's ranked higher and therefore offered to more people. So in human nature, we usually prefer to display negative emotions, anger and fear. So everything that is menacing, is threatening, has a lot of reach. And this is why you will never combat information. We will never combat disinformation by information. So we will always have a bigger outreach when disseminating negative information. And this is something that the Commission should deal with. And they should basically tell the platforms that this doesn't work. You have to share other content and other offers. And this is something that has happened before the elections, because all disinformation actors and players, right-wing parties, right-wing populists are using that. And then we have targeting, that this disinformation is offered to those groups that are quite vulnerable and susceptible to it. And they then spread that information, multiply it, and lead to it going viral. And so if a thing that is spread by 10,000 people, then it turns into a journalistic news and it goes into the media. And those are two circles that we have to interrupt. So the engagement based in ranking and the targeting of political interest. This is something that is prohibited already, but implementation is not working that well. And this is why it would be really important when we talk about big organizations and big associations to become informed on that. Face from Reset can certainly give you more information. So maybe we can sit together and write a letter to the Commission to say those are two focal points in order to prioritize right. This is the only way how this problem can be solved systematically. We could talk a lot more about it, but those are the two things that the DSA should do but doesn't do. And they are basically the game changers that could change the outcome of the elections. If I may, just briefly. What is super important in order to anticipate a bit, or what you just said, Alexandra, that what we could respond, well, I've heard already, but do we want a politics becoming involved in the feeds or curate the feed? And the platforms already do that. So it's not the case that content on platforms is simply happening. This is something this is organized and curated by observers, and of course this content that receives the majority of engagement is then fed to the feed of people. And I understand that people say we don't want to become more politics involved into the feeds, but platforms are doing corporations, and I think in the public interest there should be a counterweight. Katja. Yeah, totally agree. So questions are, how do we want to create our digital space or digital spaces? And those are questions that we may not want to decide on by ourselves. Alexandra Giza might be one of those politicians that is able to do that, but I am not. And apart from that, despite or irrespective of the elections, it is a very important year, of course, but I would like to see that we have a more constructive debate on losses. Because when we talk about climate change, we cannot keep on working and doing what we did. People will lose parts of their lifestyle. And I think this needs a very well-skilled moderation. This is not a debate that we can simply set aside. This is something where we all have to become involved to see that, of course, we want to have a socially acceptable way of dealing with the climate change, but in parallel, we have to look at how the framing of our well-being can or the prosperity can be changed. So I don't even like the wording. So how do we move and live in a world that is constantly changing, and it will keep on changing? And a negative word like losses is something where we try to avert our view. And I think this is something where we have to deal, this is what we have to deal with in order to have a positive outcome. Thank you so much. I think we might react on some of our viewers or listeners' questions. You just refer to the mechanisms on the platforms. It is a general question raised by two people. We're asking, according to you, in media like Insta and TikTok, should we be present or rather avoid those media channels in order to not give people to spread their information? This is quite interesting, an interesting approach. And another person was asking for a statement. Why should we support those big tech platforms, even if we are not satisfied with those mechanisms, with those data octopuses? So could you briefly respond to that? We have many, many more questions. So if you could keep it brief.
Ja, ich wusste nicht. Okay. Also unterstützen tun wir sie ja nicht. Die existieren.
We don't really support them. I mean, they exist independently from us. It's not that we have founded them and financed them. So, or the opposite. But what we have done for the first time in Europe, worldwide, is a regulation, and a very smart regulation that doesn't say, okay, this is labeled illegal and we have to leave it out from the debate. We still have the right of the different member states, but the regulation is trying to foster transparency, to look into what is happening and to change damaging mechanisms or strategies in collaboration with the platforms and imposing sanctions. This is the dynamic regulation that helps us to establish new procedures. But it doesn't only look at the owners, but the whole business model, the algorithms, how do we choose what people can see? And to break up this logic is something quite important.
Should you be active or not on these platforms? Of course, it's very difficult to decide, and it's a fine line, especially as a digital politician. I'm quite critical towards these platforms, but in the end, it is the communication channels by which you can reach people. And I think everyone has to take a very individual decision on which platform you want to be and you don't want to be. On X, for example, I think of course, everyone has to decide for myself. I myself have hardly any reach anymore. Yesterday, I could not see a lot of reports from demonstrations from my own hometown because they were under a content provision, so to speak. So disinformation or right-wing content has a far bigger reach. The problem is when you leave these platforms, of course, the others stay. We do see this on TikTok, and for the first time, we could see that the first voters are voting predominantly for AfD, which we did not have in the past. And there are some facts pointing to the fact that the AfD is very strong in these channels and the other parties and the rest of politics due to the Chinese problem. They are not active on this platform, but if you do no longer reach a certain age group or a certain type of audience anymore because you're no longer active on these platforms, it's no solution as well. So you should deliberately choose information channels. Of course, you do not have to be present on 6 or 7 different ones, but just choose 1 or 2 where the population group that you want to target is on. And yeah, of course, you have to decide it yourself. I mean, when you're on all the different platforms, it might have also have psychological consequences. But to withdraw completely, I mean, this would not be a political form of action. I mean, on these platforms, political will is being formed. And of course, we want to be present. If we withdraw, the others just stay. Thank you very much, Felix. Do you want to follow up on that or no? Okay. Then we have another question. There is one minute regulation question, and then we will take one step back because someone's asking, how can we regulate the targeting? Because the ban on personalized advertisement did not make it into the DSA. I would actually pass the question to Alexandra. Yeah, sure. I mean, this is my expertise. Well, the complete ban of personalized advertisement did not make it into the Act, but part of it is in it. We have a complete ban of advertising to minors, and also sensitive data cannot be used to advertise things like religious affiliation, political view, sexual orientation, or health data, which are usually used to target people with mental vulnerabilities. So this has been banned, but we still lack the implementation, but we could implement it immediately. We do not know yet how good this tool is, but it is a very sharp sword because at Facebook we know that they do not categorize their data depending on this is sensitive data and this is not. So they should change their whole collection mechanism. So it is quite a sharp sword, so to speak. And in the course of this campaign, the campaign that I've conducted and launched together with many organizations throughout Europe on the ban of personalized advertisement, the European Commission has taken a closer look on the economic aspects and has found out that there's a duopoly which controls the whole market, which is run by Google and Meta. In Germany, it's usually Google, which controls 85% of the advertisement revenue on the whole market. So this means that also the media, the press, is dependent on it. And there are quite a few studies out there, not only from the left or progressive realm, but also from more market-oriented economics professors who can show that it's absolutely detrimental to our press, free press and media and advertisement market. And I think that the Commission over the next legislative periods will look into it further, how we can change this advertisement model so that it's no longer based on personal data, but rather the content in the context of which the advertisement is placed. So I think with this campaign, we have managed to achieve half a ban, and we could raise awareness on the risks that it involves. And during the next legislative period, we will have to continue to work on that, also with other partners. Thank you very much for the explanations. I think one aspect that is very important to many people here, as I can see in the questions, is what you've said, Katja, at the beginning, in terms of communication. I mean, we already do know a lot about the root causes, and the question is, why can't we have an impact with our studies? So I would like to collect a few questions here. Martin Blanc asks, it's about emotion, not about facts. So many people are afraid that something's being taken away from them. So shouldn't we, in our communication, explain what we could win, like justice, quality of life, etc.? And someone else is asking, how could an organization or an individual communicate climate change in a good way without drowning? And someone else explained, well, maybe gamification might be also a tool to explain things. Would you like to say something, Katja? Well, I really liked what has just been mentioned, that the positive aspects should be at the forefront. This is what I do also think. Of course, we should not neglect that some people might lose something. But this is a general debate. But absolutely, how can people make sure that information and facts have an impact? I mean, this is an old tool. Human beings like to tell stories, and to tell stories in a world in which there is already climate justice, something visionary, future-oriented, but still connected to me. If I manage to do that as a climate organization or also as a politician, if I manage to make this more palpable or visible, then I've done already a lot. And we also have to get away from doing it alone. Of course, just putting aside the plastic bag will not solve the climate issue, but at the same time, it's very important which party I vote for. So I do have a big say in a democracy. So these were many aspects, but I think it's very important to tell positive stories, but not leaving out that we do need a shift, which might also be painful here and there. Felix, Alexandra, would you like to follow up on that? Well, I would like to emphasize that storytelling is very important, and we should not forget about that when we talk about disinformation. I mean, the contrary is not a very sober, fact-based, rational study publication, but storytelling can take place without distorting facts. I think it is possible to communicate in a fact-based manner, but still tell a story. Well, I would like to say two things. Storytelling, of course, this is, I had a lot of election campaigns in schools, on panels, where in 2019, the political opponent, usually men, said, this was the time of Fridays for Future, etc. So in the audience, there were many people very committed. And then the political opponents said, well, you're not always coming to school by bike. And this was quite funny because the school was next to a 4-lane road where cars were rushing by at high speed, and crossing the street was actually almost like committing suicide or an attempt to commit suicide. And I said, as a politician, it's our task to create the necessary framework conditions. I wouldn't send my kid to school by bike on this road. So if this road would not be a 4-lane road, but a smaller road, how many of you would like to take or come to school on bike? And so all the hands went up. So especially in cities, we of course can do it. But the other important aspect is that we keep discussion rooms open, because we know from different studies that women usually have a much more positive attitude towards climate protection measures, also the private realm, or to take public transport, for example, instead of a private car, or to walk on foot. They are much more likely to do that than men. They have a more positive attitude and are also investing more in sustainable products and a sustainable lifestyle. But these women usually do not dare, on the internet or in analog meetings, do not dare to speak up, because either they are met with hatred, hate speech, especially online. It comes down to their outward appearance, for example. But also in other discussions, in other realms, they're usually very dominant voices who make themselves heard. And so the question is, how can we shape participation process in a way so that women, also women with a lower income, who do not have their own car, for example, are also being heard? Because the results are completely different if you simply invite people and try to find out who has time on Tuesday, 6 in the evening. So this is a completely different situation when you try to really invite a representative group. So this is why the fight against hatred and hate speech on the internet is so important, because it's those people, women and others, who withdraw from the internet right away. And yeah. Thank you very much. In view of the time, we can answer one last question. And this is the question about cooperation. How can we coordinate ourselves better? Katja, I think this is also a very important aspect of you, Reset and Better Place. You also work together, you cooperate. And I mean, you have alliances in which you work. One person asks, are there any cooperations with other associations who work against hostility towards science and disinformation, and how can we manage to have a broader impact on society by cooperating? Well, I can start answering the question. Of course, we want to do that. I think this is very important, and we call it Alliance for a Resilient Information Society. And we want to bring different perspectives into a coordinated action, because the fight against windmills cannot be won if you go it alone. The question is, how can we together, first of all, create a larger image of the problem complex that lies before us? And Felix, you have just talked about the authority or the respective body that you would like to see. And I think this is quite a good idea. And we, for example, think that we want to bring together civil society actors, first of all, also actors from the business world, from politics, and we want to have an organic growth here, if possible. So together we would like to bring together different resources and try to find out what can the different stakeholders bring into it. And this is something that we want to facilitate and foster. But this is particularly relevant also when it comes to the implementation of the DSA, because civil society, of course, plays a specific role in the course of the DSA. And if there are different actors coming together here, especially also across country borders, then we can really join forces. And this is very important and necessary. Thank you very much to both of you. Alexandra, if it is okay for you, I would like to close this event. Okay, so there's 1 minute to go. I would like to thank you very cordially we had a big audience online. Many people were interested, many unanswered questions. So maybe we can just conduct another round or have a similar event. So thank you very much for your inputs, for the participation of the audience. And thank you very much also to the Orga team, Christine and Anna, and also the interpreters and also technical support. And last but not least, a little bit of advertisement. Next week, we will have an event on sustainable artificial intelligence. And on Monday, you can also follow it online via live stream. And I will send out the link via the chat. It's already there. So I wish you a nice afternoon and see you next time. Thank you very much.